I doubt very few of you are familiar with a man named Bob Green. Bob Green spent 24 years as the football coach at Montana Tech University in Butte, Montana. And one year, after his team had won the conference championship to assure themselves a spot in the playoffs, they found out that they would have to play the number one ranked team in the country in the first game of the playoffs. The local TV announcer asked him, "How did you feel about this?" And he said, "Well, it's kind of like watching your mother-in-law drive over the cliff in a Cadillac." He said, "There's mixed emotions." I don't know how your relationships are with your mothers-in-law or how they have been perhaps in the past. But tonight, we're going to talk about, oddly enough, two different mother-in-law situations. One, and if we want to go, we can go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 1 to start with. But there are only, by my count, by my recognition, whatever word we want to use right there, two accounts of mothers-in-law in the scripture. By the way, mothers-in-law, not mother-in-laws, but mothers on that. But two accounts of it, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament. We actually just talked about this on a Sunday night a couple of months ago, so some of you may have been familiar with at least the first part right here. But the first instance that we see a mother, and I'm not to say that there were not other people that were mothers-in-law, but actual stories that account or that first instance is found in the book of Ruth. And you may be familiar with that Old Testament book. But just a real quick overview of that story. Elimelech, who was the wife of Naomi, and their two sons in that story, had went from Judah to Moab because of a famine. And their two sons then, when they move into this new place, this new territory, married two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. And Ruth is sort of the main character within this story. Eventually, Elimelech dies, and his sons so Naomi, the mother-in-law, decided that she would return to Judah. But she tells the two daughters-in-law, she says, to remain in Moab, find new husbands, which makes sense because she's an older woman and she's going to go back to their home or original home. And she says for the two girls whose husbands are dead, stay here. This is where you're from. This is your home. Stay here. Find a new husband. You can stay within. Orpah does, but Ruth does not. And Ruth refuses to stay. In the Bible, in that story, we read that she tells Naomi, she says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And you can see that up there, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 16. But once in Judah, even after Ruth makes this sort of move back with the mother-in-law to now she's in a foreign territory, once she's there, she's discriminated against because she was an outsider. She was not a Jew in a territory that was full of Jewish people. Naomi, though, on the other hand, treats her with great love, with great respect, with kindness, tenderness, whatever it might would be. Ruth helped to support the mother-in-law. She worked in the fields, gleaning grain, all of that. And while she was there, she meets Boaz, and Boaz was related to Naomi, and he was the owner of the field. They eventually fall in love and they get married. But long story short, you follow all the way down through that. You can read in the genealogy, Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. And then David, of course, the great king of Israel. That's through the same line that Jesus comes down from. But this is our example. This is a story here of a mother-in-law in the scriptures. But that's not a miracle. Maybe it was a miracle that they all got along. But that's not a miracle in the sense that we're thinking about here today. The miracle that we are going to talk about is Peter's mother-in-law. Okay? And Peter's mother-in-law. So a couple of things. I know this is kind of small for this, but I want to do want to hit on a couple of things. The miracle takes place in Capernaum. And again, we're going in order here. And so, by the way, I did not include the picture of the synagogue in Capernaum. I didn't want 3 weeks in a row of that same picture included there. But the miracle takes place in Capernaum. Several others have taken place here. It takes place on the Sabbath. Like we said, Capernaum, one of these spots right here beside the Sea of Galilee. And if you go a little down here. Tradition says, now this is sort of traditional things, but tradition says that Peter's house was 100 yards from the synagogue. 100 yards the football field. So if you're at one end zone, you look at the other end zone, that's where it was. There's actually a church that's built on that spot today. Now, this was kind of interesting reading about it though, but one problem among many with attempting to locate biblical places is that it's really hard to locate things after 2,000 years. Most of us take something home tonight and set it down, and we can't find it tomorrow, much less trying to locate a place that may or may not have been in a certain spot 2,000 years ago. But Emperor Constantine, if you know Emperor Constantine, he was the first Roman emperor to accept Christianity sort of fully. His mother-in-law, oddly enough, came to Israel around 300 AD and had churches built on various spots to represent places in the New Testament. Now, this seems like a really nice gesture. We were build these churches in honor of things. But the problem is, by everything that I've read, she didn't have a clue what she was doing. She said, well, this is where that happened, and this is where that happened. And so a lot of things that became traditional probably weren't necessarily right there where it was. So I'm saying you could go to Capernaum and walk about 100 yards away from the synagogue, and you might be where Peter's house was, and you may not. There's no way of knowing necessarily where that would be. But according to Mark and Luke, after Jesus left the synagogue, he goes to the house of Peter and Andrew, Simon Peter, either one. And Simon Peter's wife's mother, his mother-in-law, was sick with a fever there in the house. And so they left the synagogue. They've been in the synagogue, and they're going to Peter's house. And so I think that sets the stage a bit for where we are located, where we are. And this is continuing a rather busy set of days for Jesus, in which we've seen a lot of these miracles. I don't have great times necessarily on these, but they're all within a pretty brief period of one another. And so again, like the last verse last week and what Ben read just a few moments ago is that the fame, the knowledge, the word of Jesus was starting to spread into a lot of different places. Here's a hand-drawn drawing with pen and brush by artist Rembrandt from the Netherlands. This is in France. There is no telling what this picture would be worth. This is not religious at all. But if you have Netflix, there was a show on Netflix a few years ago that Mary and I watched, and it was about this break-in of an art museum in Boston. Do you remember that, Mary? And they stole like 7 pieces of art, and they have never been found. And it is a fascinating story because one of the pictures was a drawing by Rembrandt that was about as big, I don't know, about your driver's license time 2 was about how big that would be. And it's unreal to me, like these artistic things that are in the worth that they are. If you want me to sketch this picture for you later, I'll be happy to do it. Both will be stick men. There will be a skinny man and a skinny woman in the picture. So we're going to talk about this, but this story takes place in Matthew chapter 8, Mark chapter 1, and also Luke chapter 4. And so we're going to see this story 3 different times this evening. But there's a reason that I want us to go from Mark, and then we'll go into Matthew, and then we'll go to Luke. Because the story, as you know, these stories as they're told include sort of come from the perspective of different people. And just as we would today, if the news stopped and interviewed 3 of you as you walked out of church tonight, 3 of you would give a completely different description of what had happened. The story would be the same, but the way you tell it is something different. And so we'll look at all 3 of those versions here this evening. But I want to start here. This is Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 34. Mary, do you care to read Mark 1, 29 to 34? All right. So we always have a few questions, and so I want us to think about a couple of things here to start with. The first question: who's present at this? What disciples are present here? I know it says what other two, but who in the apostleship is present here? James and John. Who else? Peter, and it's definitely Peter and Andrew's house, the way they described it. We've got sort of the four most well known, probably the first mentioned, at least the first called, that were there. And so you've got apostles there in this home. Just you guessing, do you suspect that there were more people than that here? Probably so. With this notion of community and gathering at place to place, we read in the Bible that it said that the first Christians met from where to where? They met from house to house. Our concept of sort of civic buildings is fairly foreign to them. You had the temple, and Ben talked a little bit about the temple last week and what was done at the temple. But we think about all the different places that you would go. Well, those places didn't really exist at the time, but gathering from house to house. And after they leave the synagogue, they go to this place, in part because Peter's mother-in-law was ill with fever. So what does Jesus do first? And then second, what was the result? So we read in Mark here, Mark chapter 1, verse 30 and 31, we read that he took her by the hand and lifted her up. They describe her as having a fever, I think is what Mark right here says. How many of you ever had a fever before? Okay, so how many of you have ever woken up and it's like, I feel a little warm right here? How many of you have had like what's a serious fever? 106. All right, so that's too much, right? Well, you were sick. You probably remember that number because you remember how bad you felt at that time, I would imagine. Hospitalized. Yeah, you've got the stats are probably there on the form that shows it. What did you say, Connie? I think and that it's almost incapacitating, right? It almost keeps you from being. They almost seem to describe Peter's mother-in-law as being sick, and she's clearly laying down, or she is almost done for. If you have a temperature of 103 or 4 or 5, if you have it for very long, what's going to happen to you? You can have brain damage. So if you wake up and you're 99 degrees, instead of 98, well, you might miss a day of work. But this is like severe type stuff. And so Jesus does what? He takes her by the hand. The Bible says in Mark here that he lifts her up. What was the result of this? Okay, so I want us to think about some of the other miracles that we've seen. And in particular, maybe think about what we talked about last week with the demon-possessed man. But what are some methods of healing that we've seen from Jesus so far? Just a spoken word. Touched her hand, okay? I'm sorry. In all of these cases, yes, it happens immediately, but there's no really form or fashion to it, right? This is, I think, the first one where we've seen. I don't know how you envision these things in your head, but I can envision somebody laying on a couch, or you can lay them on this pew right here, and if you take them by the hand, you kind of raise them up a little bit. Well, if it's Will laying right there, I'm going to jerk him up real hard right there. But if it's somebody that's got 102 temperature, I'm not going to do that, right? That's probably not. But we see here that Jesus raises this, and she's healed right then. Go ahead. Yes. At no point have we heard ta-da at the end, right? We've not seen that. In fact, last week we talked about how that when Jesus healed the demon-possessed man, he pretty much says to the demons, "Get out of here," right? And then he just fell right back into the teaching almost. Why do you think that? I'm glad Mary said that, but why is that? Why do we continually see Jesus first use different methods of healing, and then second of all, sort of brush it aside after the fact? Right. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we will come back to that just saying. So again, we see Jesus using different methods because if you didn't hear what Ben said, if you're using the same, if it's always this every time, then the method becomes, like Ben said, the miracle. But then that low profile, because we've already seen, we talked about it last week, that Jesus was already being sort of crowded in with this. Now, Mark. True. And which is a good lesson even for us as well, not as miracle workers, we're not that, but we have to know where we need to meet people as well. What does Peter's mother-in-law do after this? Mark 1 and verse 31. How does she respond to this? She got up and started waiting on him. Now, this is kind of fascinating to me, depending upon translation. And this is a debated translation issue. The last part of verse 31, it says that she, let me say it right to begin with, she served them. The Bible, there is debate on, does this say served him or served them in the translation? And there's a slight difference in that, because if you served him, serving Jesus, like after the fact, or serve them as the entirety of the group, I don't know that necessarily affects the appreciation that's there, but that's like a debated issue as to what that word actually should be. Does that affect anything in your opinion? Mary? That's just like, Tony, we were talking earlier about you making the food for everybody, right? Just come on over. We'll lay it all out there, right? That's just, it's him. It's not a him situation right there. But nonetheless, though, what can you maybe glean from Peter's mother-in-law's character, if that's the word we want to use, in verse 31? Absolutely. I've got that saved for at the end, but that's true. How many of you have ever uttered this sentence? I'm feeling some better. How many of you have ever been sick and then after a couple of days you went to work and you got home from work and you were just whipped? Like, I just got to lay down. Linda, this sounds really familiar here in the last few weeks with you right there. And we all know what that's like, because are we better? Yes. Are we healed? Not really. It takes if you have pneumonia, if you have the flu or something like that, you can get around a little bit. It takes a long time to overcome. But I think you're right here. She went from, I'm ready, I can get up and serve. Right. So we have two members of your family that have openly admitted to not liking the waiting on people. So when they tell him stories about Boo, it all starts to make sense right now. She just ran them out of the house. She's like, I'll take care of this. Y'all don't need to do it right there. But first of all, I do wonder if she woke up and wondered if Mary and Martha was there, because she's always fussing about serving people right there. But when she does, she's clearly of a health that would allow her to be able, and like Ben said, that was part of the culture. That was Mary and Martha fussed about that, right? Martha said, why is she in there? We should be in here working. She's in there listening. But that was that cultural thing that happens there as well. Other thoughts on this before we go a little further? Let's go to Matthew chapter 8. You can go or not, but it's on the screen, but you got it here right here as well. This is the Matthew version of the story. And by the way, all of these, this is a brief, there is really no information given right here. There are 3 and 4, 5 verses for each of these. So it's not an in-depth story. It's interesting that John, at the end of John, it says you couldn't fill the books with all the things that Jesus had done. Well, sometimes you do wish they'd added a little bit more information, especially if you're teaching a class about it, but that's neither here nor there. This is Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. Will, do you care to read this one? Okay, so it's a similar description. There's a couple of things that are slightly different right there, especially in verse 15. It said he touched her hand, the fever left her, and then she arose. You can interpret that, it's slightly different as helping someone up. But either way, I think the point there is still. But that last part, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. This is not original to Matthew. This is Matthew quoting from Isaiah chapter 53. Now, the whole 53rd chapter of Isaiah traces back through to Jesus, and it's a lot of verses, but I only pulled a handful of them right here. But this is Isaiah 53, 4 through 6. Tell me if this sounds, first of all, familiar, and second of all, do you see what Matthew wrote in Isaiah 53, 4, 5, and verses 4, 5, and 6? Boo, do you care to read this one? Now, there's more, but how many of you have read this before or heard this? I feel like all of us probably have. Well, that's where Matthew chapter 8, verse 17 pulls this from. He says that it would be fulfilled that which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. So I want to think about after sunset, and this after Sabbath was over, what happens here? Matthew chapter 8 and verse 16. What happens at this point? Brought a lot of people in for what reason? All right. So it seems like kind of a hodgepodge of people that got issues. It was pretty good time to bring them in, right? Now, it is interesting that it says after sunset. Why? Right? And Jesus faced some criticism for that, right? Healing on the Sabbath. And he faced that. And Ben, I think you mentioned it last week, Luke 4, it's kind of a technicality that they would try to get him on. But you can see how strong this sort of culture was, that the people was like, we're going to go see him, but we're still going to wait until sunset. But they go, and we read there in Matthew chapter 8 in verse 18, did I say 8, 16? I'm sorry. We read there, when evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon possessed, and he cast out spirits with the word and healed all those who were sick. Would you have went to Jesus in this situation? Why? This is our fifth miracle, and we're going in order. So this is our fifth. If you look at this, this is probably a week, 2 weeks at most sort of period. It's all happening pretty quick. We've talked about the word getting around. And so now it's become a matter of, this is maybe my salvation. This is my, maybe not spiritual salvation, but my physical salvation. Why do you go to the doctor with a fever of 102? To get better. We don't have Jesus that can heal us the way that they did back then, but we have doctors and medicine that can hopefully do something for us. We're trying to get that fixed. And so these people all come in, like we see here, after sunset, after the Sabbath ends, and they come in and putting words into their mouth. They're almost saying like, fix me, heal me. Now, good thing about this is what? It's bringing people to Jesus. What might be a bad thing? Is there a bad thing here? If we're not careful, and that's why we're going to go in and read Luke here in just a second. If we're not careful, what's the main attraction here? The miracles. And how many people do you think, and again, all this is just guessing, do you think anybody went just to see what was happening? I'm not sick, but she is, and I heard she's going, so I'm going to ease on over there and just see what the whole mess is about there as well. And so that's something to sort of, so Jesus sort of straddles this line throughout his teaching in the New Testament of job to do, but don't so much that that is the only thing that people might be interested in. Thoughts before we go any further? And that's something we see that, we do see that quite often. Let's go to this last verse then, or this last, we read it from Mark, we've read it from Matthew, we now read it from Luke. This is Luke chapter 4, 38 through 41. Again, these stories, these accounts are going to be very similar to each other, but there are some subtle differences in each of the three. Let's see. Linda Denham, do you care to read this one? You knew I was calling for you. You was reaching for the reaching right there. Luke 4, 38 through 41. All right, so we see the word rebuke here a couple of times. We see it on sort of the healing front end, and then on the sort of post situation afterwards. Is there any difference in the first couple of verses here? A little bit. We see. He goes to Peter's house. He stood over her, rebuked the fever. What does that mean? Told it to come out, perhaps, however you want to interpret that. But it left her. And it says then, though, and immediately she arose and did what? And served them. So we've seen that again. So these accounts here, these three different people are telling us that Jesus sort of heals this woman of it. Now, Luke goes into something that we don't really see in the other two, and that's on the back end, verses 40 and 41. He mentions in verse 40 that when the sun sets, all these people show up. And as you see, they were sick with various diseases, brought them to him, laid hands on every one of them, and healed them. And the demons also came out of many, crying out and saying, what? That should sound somewhat familiar, because we looked at something very similar last week when we talked about the healing of the demon-possessed man. At the end there, the last part of the verse, and he rebuking them does what? What's the last thing up here on the screen? Didn't allow him to speak. Why? Does that sound familiar? That was last week, right? That they recognized who Jesus was. And so we've seen times, and we will see times, you may be familiar with times, where Jesus has told people, like you said a minute ago, don't go out and tell this. Because then we go from information, teaching, and preaching to sideshow. But he even tells this, he says, rebuking them, these demons, saying, not allowing them to speak, because they knew who he was as well. Right? Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes. Yeah. Good. Good. Other thoughts on the story? We got a couple other things we're going to look at. But first of all, when you're looking at a story of a miracle, like we said a minute ago, every one of these was like 4 verses long, 5 verses long. It was very, very small amounts. I think the amount of time given over to them shows about how much time Jesus wanted to spend on the miracle. There's far more teaching in the 4 Gospels than there are miracles. There's 35 miracles, but if you add up the verses, there's a handful of verses, 2 or 3 or 4 here and there, but these miracles don't get a lot of time. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, Matthew chapter 7, the Sermon on the Mount, that's 3 full chapters of teaching. So what's more important? The chapters upon chapters of teaching, or the verse upon verse of healing using miracles? Okay. What else? Mhm. Okay. Right. Did the miracles assure anybody of a home in heaven when their life was over? Open the door, might expose some things. Where was the salvation in? In Christ, in Christ's actions. And when Christ was gone, it would be reflected back to Christ's what? Well, the teaching, right? They're going to reflect that. That's what you're going to refer back to right there. That it's kind of hard teaching a lesson about miracles because these are just sort of the singular entity, the thing that happened. But the more important is what sort of surrounds it and what came from that as a result. I've already asked that question, I guess. So let's take a couple of things home with us. All right, a couple of things to go with. So first of all, too tired doesn't always cut. How many of us have ever been too tired? All of us have, right? We kind of all definitely have in that point. What do you think Jesus was feeling when he walked out of the synagogue to go to Peter's house? I suspect it was. How many of you, when you're leaving work, are ready to go home, sit down, put your feet up, and relax for just a minute? Well, none of y'all been retired for 20 years, every one of you. Y'all are ready to work when everybody else is ready to get home. Right? But think back to, a couple years ago when you left work and you would go home, you're ready to kind of stop, right? Well, where is Jesus's quote unquote place of work? It was sort of everywhere he went. We talked about that on Sunday, that Jesus didn't live a closed life. He was open life wherever he went. And everywhere he went, you can imagine there were people, especially by this point, can you fix this? Can you do that? Can you do this? Can you do that? That sort of always went. But too tired here doesn't always cut it. And while obviously, yes, there needs to be time to get away. Obviously, there's time for us to sort of relax. Jesus had been teaching the whole day. He wants to go home, or at least go to his friend's home, eat and rest. Did it work out for him? Did he get to do what he was hoping to do, maybe we would say? But who benefited by him going to Peter and Andrew's house, or to Peter's house especially? Peter's mother-in-law right then and there. And so he went from work to another form of work. He went to fix whatever it maybe was that needed to be fixed. Number two. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when we look at this, though, this notion of repaying sort of gratitude with gratitude, but not just gratitude with service. When Peter's mother-in-law was healed, if that had been us, what's the first thing that we likely would have said when we stood up off the bed? We'll just say that. What would we most likely have said first? Probably thank you, right? That's the first thing that would have come to mind. Well, that's gratitude with gratitude, right? That's being gracious for what it was. But we read here in every single one of these. We read it in Mark, we read it in Matthew, we read it in Luke. Every one of them, she arose and did what? And she immediately fell into helping Jesus. Would she have been within her rights to have sort of sat down, took a deep breath and said, man, there's something else? I probably would have done that. You know, if you've been, I feel like if I've been sick, if I've been near death, and I get raised up and everything's good right now, I probably would have been time to like sit down on the stool for a second. Man, can you believe there's a lot to take in right there? I mean, it probably would have. But what does she do? She doesn't think about herself, right? It's easy to say thank you. Sometimes it's a little harder to sort of repay that the way that she did. The third one, following Jesus doesn't exempt us from troubles. Earlier in all three of these books, Peter had decided to follow Jesus. Peter had been told, convinced, asked, whatever word you want to use there, to follow Jesus, and he did. I don't know when his mother-in-law started being sick, but I know our time frame here is pretty small. It may well be that she got sick after he started following Jesus. It may well be that she was sick before he started following Jesus. We don't know, and it doesn't really matter. But the point is that we would list Peter pretty high on the people who played a prominent role in the early church. But Peter had problems just like we did. Peter's mother-in-law was deathly ill. We can all relate to that, right? Not with our mother-in-law, but fill that blank in with somebody else, some kind of issue, some kind of problem. We might also, when we're dealing with this, utter the two-word question. Why me? Why me? That's easy for us to think of because we're human, right? Because we are wondering, why did this very well say, I have decided to follow Jesus. Shouldn't this be happening to other people and not me? Well, that's not the way it works, right? How many Christians do you know who have never had any kind of health issue in their family? The answer is zero. Because how many people you know who have never had health issues in their family? Nobody has. They all have. And so just because we follow Jesus doesn't exempt us from trouble. The Bible is full of people, a lot of times that we see that are good or bad, who are faced with illness, right? Well, we know people every day that are faced with illness. How many of you have known somebody in the past and they're sick, they get cancer, whatever, and you say, oh man, that's the nicest person in the world. How many of you have known people that get sick with those kind of illnesses and you would not describe them as the nicest person in the world? It hit across the spectrum right there. See, those people that were ill, possessed, those people that had issues, they were the people that Jesus was looking to heal. But the people that was right there with him, like Peter, they had the same issues as well. They all had the troubles, but they all needed that help that would come from it as well. We know that it's appointed to us once to die, right? And after that, the judgment. Peter's mother-in-law died. I don't know when. It never says in the Bible. Somewhere down the line, Peter died. Peter's wife died. Jesus died. But we're appointed, it says in the Bible, once to die. After that, the judgment. And so the troubles aren't exempt on earth, but the trouble-free time is when? Amen. So we can't hope for a trouble-free time here. It won't happen. But there has to be hope of a trouble-free time somewhere else along the way. Before we close, thoughts from anyone? Hot here, Connie. Jill, I said you're ringing up with sweat. Just burning up. Other thoughts before we close? Sure. Uh-huh.